She was just walking to her car. No crime, no reason to be stopped. But when the red and blue lights flashed, and the officer stepped out with that familiar look, authority, assumption, control, she knew exactly where this was going. What he didn't know, he was about to arrest the wrong woman. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you love powerful stories like this, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment. Your support helps us keep these stories alive. The night air was thick with the hum of city life. Distant car horns, laughter spilling from rooftop bars, the rhythmic click of heels on pavement. Downtown Dallas, Texas, was alive, glowing with the neon hues of nightlife and the warm flicker of street lamps reflecting off wet pavement. Naomi Carter moved through it all with quiet confidence, her heels clicking with purpose as she stepped out of Lorenzo's Steakhouse, a high-end spot where the city's elite dined. Dressed in a sleek, form-fitting black mini dress, she looked every bit the part of a woman who belonged in such a setting. Elegant, composed, untouchable. But she wasn't just another socialite. Beneath the layers of silk and sophistication was a U.S. Marshal, a woman who had spent the last decade hunting fugitives, dismantling trafficking rings, and navigating the brutal realities of law enforcement. Tonight wasn't about work, but work had found its way into the evening regardless. The man she had met inside, a confidential informant, had just given her the final piece of information she needed for an ongoing federal case. She was heading back to her car, ready to process it further. Then the red and blue lights flashed. She barely had time to unlock her black Dodge Challenger before the familiar wail of a siren sliced through the air. The glow of the police cruiser's lights bounced off the high-end vehicles parked along the curb, making her car's glossy black paint shimmer under the neon. Naomi didn't freeze, didn't react too quickly. Instead, she took a slow breath, watching through the side mirror as the driver's door of the patrol car swung open. The man who stepped out was exactly what she expected. Officer Jake Reynolds, mid-40s, stocky build, a face that carried the hardened look of someone who had spent years with unchecked authority. His movements were calculated, deliberate. His hand hovered a little too close to his belt, not quite on his gun, but close enough to remind anyone who was watching that he could use it. Naomi had seen men like him before. Men who didn't expect to be questioned. She turned, standing tall in her heels, her expression unreadable. The first few seconds of an encounter like this were always the most telling. Who had the power, who was posturing, and who was about to make a mistake? Reynolds stopped a few feet from her, his gaze sweeping over her slowly, deliberately, not just assessing, but judging. "Ma'am," he started, voice laced with authority, "I'm going to need you to step away from the vehicle." Naomi raised a single brow. No pretense, no introduction, just a command. She didn't move. "What seems to be the problem, officer?" Reynolds' lips pressed into a thin line. He took another step closer, eyes flicking toward her car before landing back on her. "This your vehicle?" Naomi let the question hang for a second longer than necessary, watching the way his jaw tensed at her silence. "Yes," she finally said. "Is that a problem?" Reynolds didn't answer immediately. Instead, his gaze dragged over her again, this time with a different kind of scrutiny, the kind that suggested he had already decided what kind of woman she was. "You fit a description," he said smoothly. Naomi's stomach tightened, though her expression remained calm. "Here we go." "What description is that?" Reynolds exhaled sharply, as if annoyed that she hadn't just obeyed the first time. "There was a call about a possible suspect in the area, a woman fitting your description, black, early 30s, expensive car, questionable presence." Questionable presence. She nearly laughed. Naomi had been in law enforcement long enough to know that he had nothing. No real probable cause, no crime in progress. Just an assumption, wrapped in the thin veil of procedure. She could have ended it right there. She could have pulled out her badge, cut the interaction short. But something in the way Reynolds squared his shoulders, the way he was itching for control, made her pause. So she let him keep talking. "Gonna need to see some ID," Reynolds added, tone firm. Naomi glanced down at her clutch purse, but didn't reach for it. Not yet. She knew the game. Reach too quickly, and suddenly she's a threat. Move too slowly, and she's being uncooperative. So she tilted her head slightly, voice even. And if I refuse? Reynolds smirked, as if that was exactly what he wanted her to say. Then I'll have to assume you're hiding something. There it was. The thinly veiled threat of escalation. Naomi had two choices. Play along and let him believe he had control for a little longer, or show her hand, now. She decided to let him dig his own grave a little deeper. Slowly, carefully, she set her clutch on the roof of the car, her movements deliberate. I'd rather not be late, she said coolly. So let's get this over with. Reynolds stepped closer, his chest almost brushing hers as he reached for his cuffs. You're under suspicion, he said, as if he was doing her a favor. Turn around. Naomi didn't turn. Instead, she let out a slow, measured breath, feeling the cold metal of her badge pressing against her hip. He had no idea what was coming next. Naomi could feel the weight of Reynolds' presence behind her, the impatient shift of his stance, the way his fingers hovered just over his cuffs. He was waiting for her to comply, to turn around and let him dictate how this moment would play out. But she didn't move. Instead, she let the silence stretch, heavy and unyielding, the kind that made men like him uncomfortable. Reynolds exhaled sharply, his frustration bleeding through. I said, turn around. Naomi lifted her chin slightly, just enough to meet his gaze. Under what charge? Reynolds' smirk faltered, just for a second. I don't have to explain myself to you. And that was his first mistake. The law was built on procedure, on rules that separated authority from tyranny. But men like Reynolds didn't enforce laws, they enforced control. Naomi had seen this playbook before, the escalation game. It was subtle at first, sharp tone, the flex of power, the tightening of space. If that didn't work, it became a forced display of dominance. And if that failed, then came the cuffs, the force, the radio call for backup. She had watched it happen to others more times than she could count, but never to her. She let out a slow breath, knowing what was coming next before he even reached for her wrist. The moment Reynolds grabbed her arm, she moved. Not violently, not recklessly, just with precision. Her wrist twisted, body shifting at an angle that forced his grip to loosen just enough for her to break free. The movement was clean, effortless, the kind of maneuver that came from years of training, not defiance, not resistance, just complete control. Reynolds stumbled back, eyes widening in disbelief. Naomi stayed perfectly still, her expression unreadable. You're making a mistake. Shh. The flicker of panic in Reynolds' eyes was almost imperceptible, but she caught it. He was rethinking, calculating. For the first time in this encounter, it had occurred to him that maybe, just maybe, he had miscalculated. But the problem with men like Reynolds was that they never admitted when they were wrong. Instead of backing down, his jaw locked. His hand shot toward his holster, not his gun, but his taser. Naomi had had enough. With one deliberate motion, she reached for her clutch, flicked it open, and pulled out her badge. The silver emblem caught the glow of the streetlights, the letters unmistakable. U.S. Marshal, Department of Justice. Reynolds froze. Whatever words had been sitting on his tongue died in his throat. His gaze locked onto the badge, his pupils shrinking like a man who had just realized he had stepped onto thin ice. Naomi watched it happen in real time, the unraveling. The confidence? Gone. The control? Shattered. Now, she said, her voice sharp but steady. You want to tell me what law I broke? Reynolds didn't speak, couldn't. Because there was no law, no actual reason, just an assumption wrapped in authority, and now that assumption had turned on him like a loaded gun. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Naomi tilted her head, letting him sit in his own silence. You were real quick to put hands on me, she continued, voice quiet but lethal. So tell me, Officer Reynolds, what was your plan? Arrest me? Charge me with something? What exactly were you going to write in your report? The weight of his mistake settled on him like a vice. His fingers twitched at his side, jaw clenched so tight she could hear his teeth grind. But Naomi wasn't done. She took a step forward, watching as he instinctively took a half step back. The shift in power was complete. "I could end your career with a phone call," she said, her voice dropping just enough that only he could hear it. "Or I could let you stand here and keep embarrassing yourself." Reynolds' nostrils flared. His entire body locked up with a mix of anger and shame. He wasn't used to being on this side of a confrontation. He wasn't used to losing. And that was his second mistake. Because Naomi? She never lost. The weight of his mistake settled like a stone in Reynolds' gut, heavy and inescapable. He was still standing, still breathing, but the power he thought he had was already gone. Naomi had taken it from him without raising her voice, without lifting a finger. And she knew it. She saw it in the way his shoulders tensed, in the way his fingers curled into fists at his sides, not in readiness, but in restraint, the fight-or-flight response of a man who just realized he had stepped off a cliff. Naomi let the silence stretch between them, watching as Reynolds' face twitched through every stage of recognition. Confusion, panic, desperation. She had seen it before, the way men like him scrambled for an escape hatch. Some doubled down, tried to claw back the control they'd lost. Others found excuses, threw out flimsy justifications to soften the fall. Reynolds? He chose the worst option. He tried to pretend nothing had happened. His jaw tightened. His eyes flicked between the badge and Naomi's face, and then, without a word, he took a slow step back. Like distance could erase everything. Like if he just rewound the moment far enough, maybe he wouldn't be standing here, humiliated under the glow of his own patrol car's lights. Naomi arched a brow. That's it? Reynolds' throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. His voice, when it came, wasn't nearly as steady as it had been before. Must have been some kind of mix-up, he muttered. Naomi exhaled slowly, shaking her head. A mix-up. She repeated it, letting the words taste like contempt. Reynolds didn't respond. He couldn't. Because what was he supposed to say? That he had decided she didn't belong here? That the sight of a black woman in a tight dress and a fast car had set off an alarm in his head? That he had convinced himself she was something she wasn't, simply because it made more sense to him that way? Naomi watched his entire belief system crumble in real time. Then the radio on his shoulder crackled to life. "Reynolds, status update." The voice was sharp, authoritative, a superior officer. And just like that, Reynolds' situation worsened. Naomi could practically see the war raging inside of him. How much truth could he afford to admit? Reynolds cleared his throat, hand rising to press the radio's button. "Nothing to report." His voice was flat, carefully controlled. "False alarm." Naomi smirked. "Coward." Another silence. Then the voice came through again, this time clipped with irritation. "That false alarm just so happens to be on my screen right now. Let's try that again." Reynolds flinched. Naomi turned her head slightly, catching the faint reflection of flashing lights in the tinted windows of a nearby building. A second patrol car. Her smirk deepened. "Oh, this just got interesting." Reynolds must have seen it too, because his breath hitched. Naomi had given him a way out, a lifeline. She had let him back away, let him pretend this never happened. He should have taken it. But now, someone else was watching. The second cruiser pulled up behind Reynolds' patrol car and a door swung open. Sergeant Mark Davis. Older, sharper, the kind of officer who had seen it all and had no patience for incompetence. His gaze flicked between Naomi, still standing tall in her heels, and Reynolds, who suddenly looked like a rookie caught red-hand. Davis took in the scene with the kind of quick calculating glance that only came with experience. The shift in Reynolds' posture, the nervous clench of his jaw, the faint glint of Naomi's U.S. Marshal badge still visible in the glow of the streetlights. And Naomi saw it clear as day, he knew. Davis exhaled through his nose, then turned to Reynolds, his tone clipped. "What exactly am I looking at here, officer?" Reynolds hesitated. Too long. Naomi crossed her arms, waiting. She wasn't going to answer for him. And when Reynolds finally spoke, his voice was quieter, duller, the voice of a man who knew there was no saving this. "Just a misunderstanding," he mumbled. Davis stared at him for a beat longer. Then he turned to Naomi. His expression didn't carry the same arrogance Reynolds had. "Ma'am," he said smoothly, voice even, "do you need assistance?" Naomi let the question settle, let Reynolds stew in the humiliation of it. Finally, she shook her head, her tone just as smooth. "Not anymore." She turned to leave, but before she stepped into her car, she paused, just long enough to glance back at Reynolds, voice dropping low enough that only he could hear. "Next time." She met his eyes, and for the first time all night, he looked away first. "Be very careful who you put your hands on." Then she slid into her car, door closing with a sharp click. Reynolds stood there, silent, humiliated, dismantled. And as Naomi pulled away, she caught a glimpse of him in the rearview mirror, his superior still standing beside him, waiting for an explanation he would never be able to give. Naomi drove in silence, the hum of the engine steady beneath her fingers. The city lights blurred past, their neon glow streaking against the windshield, but her mind wasn't on the road. It was still back there, with Reynolds, with the look on his face as the power drained from his stance, as his own authority collapsed around him like a house of cards. She had seen men like him before, too comfortable in their control, too convinced they were untouchable, and she had seen what happened when reality hit them like a freight train. They either learned or they doubled down. Naomi didn't care which one Reynolds chose. That was his problem now. A phone buzzed in the cup holder. She glanced down, saw the name flash across the screen. Sergeant Mark Davis. A slow exhale. She had expected this. With a flick of her thumb, she answered, "Carter." Davis's voice came through, low and even. "You all right?" Naomi let out a soft, humorless chuckle. "You tell me, Sergeant." A pause, then Davis sighed. "I should have been there sooner." Naomi didn't answer right away. Davis wasn't the problem. If anything, he was one of the few in his department who still had some sense. Instead, she asked, "What happens now?" Davis hesitated. "Internal review." Of course. A slap on the wrist, maybe a few weeks of suspension. They'd dress it up like accountability, but nothing real would change. She knew that. Had always known that. "You should file a report," Davis added, his voice cautious. "I can back you." Naomi stared at the road ahead, watching as the streetlights pulsed against the dark sky. Filing a report would mean paperwork, statements, media if it leaked. She'd seen how these things played out, and if Reynolds was backed by the right people, they'd flip the narrative. Make it about her attitude, her refusal to comply, the fact that she escalated. She'd been in this system long enough to know that truth didn't always matter. Davis must have sensed her hesitation. "Look," he said, his voice softer now. "I get it. But you can't let this slide." Naomi tapped her fingers against the steering wheel, jaw tight. "Do you really think it'll change anything?" she asked finally. Davis was quiet for a beat. Then, with brutal honesty, he said, "I don't know." Naomi appreciated that. The truth, unfiltered. Because that was the thing about men like Reynolds. They weren't just bad apples. They were the result of a system that allowed them to exist, to thrive, to believe they were untouchable. And for every one that got caught, there were 10 more just like him. Naomi inhaled slowly, eyes flicking to the badge still sitting on the passenger seat, the symbol of her authority, the thing that had saved her tonight. But what if she hadn't had it? What if she had just been Naomi Carter, an ordinary black woman in a nice dress, getting into an expensive car? Would she be driving home right now? Or would she be in a holding cell, trying to prove she had done nothing wrong? The thought sat in her chest, heavy and suffocating. Finally, she spoke. "I'll think about it." Davis sighed again, but there was no disappointment in his voice. Just understanding. "All right." A pause. "Just don't let it eat at you." Naomi almost laughed at that, as if it hadn't already started. She ended the call, tossing the phone back into the cup holder. The night stretched ahead, dark and endless. But somewhere, behind her, Reynolds was still standing in that parking lot, answering questions he didn't have good answers for. And Naomi? She wasn't worried about him. She was worried about the next one. Naomi pulled into her driveway, cutting the engine. The night had stretched longer than it should have, the weight of it pressing against her chest. She sat there for a moment, fingers resting lightly on the steering wheel, staring at her own reflection in the rearview mirror. She was tired, but not surprised. This wasn't new. Wasn't the first time. Wouldn't be the last. She had walked away tonight, badge intact, reputation untouched. But that wasn't victory. That was just survival. She reached over, picked up her US Marshal badge, feeling the cool weight of it in her palm. This was her shield, her safeguard, the only thing that had kept tonight from going a different way, and that was what haunted her most. Because without it, she knew exactly how that story would have ended. Naomi exhaled slowly, pushing the door open, stepping out into the quiet of the night. Tomorrow she'd go back to work, back to chasing criminals, back to the system she had sworn to serve, even as it failed people like her. She didn't know if filing a report would change anything. He didn't know if Reynolds would face real consequences. But she did know one thing. Men like him thrived in silence. And Naomi Carter was never the type to stay quiet. Message of the story. Power isn't about the badge, it's about perception. Naomi was only protected because of her title. Without it, she would have been seen as nothing more than a suspect, a problem to be handled. Her identity saved her, but that shouldn't have been necessary. Some mistakes can't be undone, only lived with. Reynolds may have walked away without punishment, but he'll never forget this night. The shame, the unraveling, the loss of control, it will follow him whether he admits it or not. Silence allows injustice to grow. Naomi debated whether reporting Reynolds would change anything, but the truth is, every unchecked abuse of power creates the next one. The system protects itself, but that doesn't mean it can't be challenged. This wasn't just about Reynolds, it was about a system that enables people like him, that allows bias to dictate who is guilty before a crime is even committed. Naomi's battle wasn't just against one officer, it was against a culture that saw her as a threat before it saw her as a person. Survival isn't victory. Naomi won tonight, but the fight wasn't over. Because as long as there were more like Reynolds, there would always be another confrontation waiting. And next time, someone might not have a badge to save them. Naomi's story isn't just fiction, it's a reality that too many people face. The truth is, power isn't always about who is right, but about who is believed. For many, a simple encounter can turn dangerous, not because of what they've done, but because of who they are perceived to be. So what can we learn? Stay composed, but stand your ground. In moments of tension, calmness is power. People who abuse authority expect fear or compliance. Refusing to shrink forces them to confront their actions. Know your rights. Authority figures don't always act within the law. Understanding your rights protects you from being manipulated or intimidated. Hold people accountable. When power is unchecked, it festers. If no one speaks up, nothing changes. Whether it's reporting misconduct or supporting those who do, silence should never be an option. Privilege is real, use it wisely. Not everyone has a badge to shield them. If you do, don't just use it to protect yourself, use it to challenge the system that makes it necessary. The fight isn't just about one bad cop, it's about a culture that allows them to exist, and that is why the conversation can't end here.